Everyone, good evening. Good evening. Well, welcome to St. Thomas More. To those of you here in person and those of you who are live streaming. My name is Andy Otto. I'm the Pastoral Associate for Adult Faith Formation and Education. And if you're not a member of STM, or if it's your first time here, you are very welcome. We're glad you're here. Every year we like to invite a major speaker to address topics and issues important to Catholics and to broaden our own perspectives on church and society and theology. This evening we're so grateful to have Michael O'Loughlin, who has done tremendous work documenting the important stories and lived experience of many of those within and without the church during the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 90s. Mike has invested deeply in his work, capturing the stories of those doing the hidden work of the gospel, even while much of the institutional church at the time was maintaining fear, stigma, and shame around HIV and AIDS and the LGBT community. This evening we'll take an interview and conversation format, and we'll leave Q&A to the end of the main portion. For those in person, there are index cards at the end of the pews with pencils, and you're welcome to write a question, and we'll collect them from you at the beginning of the Q&A time. For those watching on the live stream, you can submit questions online, and we'll put the URL on the screen when it's time. And there's also, the link is in the description below the video player. If you need to use the restroom, you just exit out the back and take a left. Now let me introduce Michael and Lindsay, who will be guiding the conversation. Michael O'Loughlin is an award-winning journalist and the national correspondent for America Media, who writes and speaks regularly about religion and politics. He's the host of the podcast Plague: Untold Stories of AIDS and the Catholic Church, recommended by the New York Times and featured on NPR. His book, Hidden Mercy: Catholics, AIDS, and the Untold Stories of Compassion in the Face of Fear, was actually, the podcast was based on the book, not the other way around. And this is what we'll be discussing tonight. Prior to joining America Magazine, Mike was a national reporter for the Boston Globe. He's written for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, National Catholic Reporter, and The Advocate. He's been featured on MSNBC, Fox News, ABC, CBS, and NPR, and he lives in Chicago. Lindsay Faust is a third-year Master of Divinity student at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. She's worked with Candler Catholic Studies Program and Emory's Aquinas Center of Theology to help grow the Catholic community and bring Catholic speakers and events to Emory's campus. Here at STM, she is a third-grade catechist, which I know she loves dearly, and is helping to launch a group for LGBTQ plus Catholics. After graduating in May, she will pursue pediatric hospital chaplaincy. So I'm grateful for Lindsay to guide the conversation and for Michael to be here.
Thanks, Andy. Excellent. Again, thanks so much, Michael. We're super happy to have you. Thanks so much for writing such a wonderful book. I loved reading it. It was really, really affecting and really beautiful. So I guess just for anybody here who hasn't gotten a chance to pick up the book yet, what would you tell them about what this book is at its core?
Sure, thank you. And thanks for being part of this tonight. I appreciate it. And thank you all for coming out or watching online. I know a Saturday night on a beautiful early spring day, there's probably a lot of possibilities for you, so thank you for choosing to spend some of it here tonight. It's a good question. Why this book? Why now? What's kind of the central message? And I would say that it's been years in the making for a couple different reasons. And one is when I started reporting full-time, it was back in 2010, 2011 or so, and a lot of my coverage was about LGBT issues in the Catholic Church. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was that is what people were talking about at the time. So there were debates over same-sex marriage, LGBT civil rights laws, different movements in the church, outside the church, to make LGBT people more visible. And I was assigned to write about the news, so that's what I was writing about. But there was also this personal component where I was trying to figure out, as a gay Catholic myself, did I have a place in the church? And I used a lot of my reporting to kind of explore those questions. And I felt very alone at the time. I felt like I was going through this for the first time, that no one had done this before, kind of angsty and young and just really on my own. And I was sort of unloading all this on a priest friend one evening at dinner, and he listened patiently, and then he told me that he wanted to share a little bit about his early ministry with me. He was a few decades older, that he had actually, as a young priest on a college campus in the 1990s, learned that HIV and AIDS was affecting some of the community on the campus, and that there were very little resources for the community. And they asked if he could provide some space, and he agreed and opened up the Catholic Student Center and said, you can meet here. His bishop found out about it and kind of called him into the office and asked him to shut down the ministry because he was afraid it was sending a signal that the church was supporting the gay rights movement. My friend said no. He kind of framed it as a pro-life ministry, that people were dying, the church had to respond. And I was really just amazed by that, because I had known my friend pretty well, but I didn't know anything about this part of his early ministry. And it was a good example, albeit a fairly small one, of a Catholic standing by the gay community at a time when they were facing enormous amounts of pressure from society. And he explored me to examine this time more. He thought there might be some value in learning some of this history, of connecting with other LGBT Catholics who have a variety of experiences at this time. And that was kind of setting me off for the next 5 years of research and looking at Catholics who, against a very harsh background, responded with care and compassion to people with HIV and AIDS. And that's sort of the central message of the book.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. You're so right. Yeah, this central core of your conversations of people who received care and people who gave care during the crisis is so beautiful. And I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about what it was like to be privy to those conversations. What was it like to listen to people talk about such a delicate time?
Yeah, it was intense. I remember the first conversation I had. It was a hot August day. It was a phone conversation. I had just gotten back from the National Catholic AIDS Network archives that are housed at Loyola in Chicago, where I live. And I'd been thumbing through papers and newspaper magazine articles, and I came across this small article from the Associated Press from the 1980s about these two nuns who had packed up. They lived in a small city in southern Illinois and moved to New York City. They wanted to learn about HIV and AIDS care. And I kind of thought, that's interesting. Nuns moving to New York at the height of the AIDS crisis, like, that's a good story. Yeah. So I decided to kind of dig a little deeper. I found out one of the sisters had passed away a couple years earlier, so I couldn't contact her, but one was still around, still in the same town. So I did some digging and found her email address, sent her an email, and we started corresponding and eventually had a 2-hour phone conversation where I write about in the book. It was pretty intense at first because she was asking me why I wanted to hear her stories. She hadn't talked about them in decades at this point. And I write about in the book how I had to muster up the courage to tell her that I'm gay and I wanted to learn some of this history. And she didn't care at all and proceeded to spend 2 hours talking. But it was a really intense first phone call because I wasn't sure what I would expect. And she kind of, Sister Carol Baltashevitz is her name. She's one of the main characters in the book if you've had a chance to read it. She had some stories that were clearly well-worn that she had told many times, but there was still a lot of trauma there. Yeah. There was a lot of emotional healing, I think, that had to take place. She was witness to intense amounts of pain and suffering. Her own ministry had been affected by her decision to stand by the LGBT community. She had a complicated relationship with the Catholic Church. She had left her religious order, but still considered herself Catholic. So it was a lot. Yeah. And that was sort of the first of what would end up being a couple hundred similar conversations over the next few years. And to me, what stood out was the generosity of people to share such an intimate part of their lives, a painful part of their lives in many cases, especially some of the people who are long-term HIV survivors, who lost friends or partners. Just a couple weeks ago, I was giving a talk in San Francisco, and there was an older gay Catholic man there who was a long-term HIV survivor. He was telling me it was difficult to get through the book, but he was glad that he stuck with it. And he said that he had this group of friends in his 20s that are all gone, that all of them but 2 had died of age-related complications, and he didn't have the kind of network that he would have had anymore. And the trauma that he still felt came through because someone was asking about these conversations. So it was a lot, but it's been such a joy to be able to bring these stories to audiences who haven't heard them yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, yeah, how special, I'm sure. I'm so glad that you brought up this sense that, a lot of people don't have people to share these stories with, or have lost a lot of the people that they went through this time with. And you spoke a lot in the book about a sense of needing to know your history to kind of know your identity. What do you think this book has to tell to gay Catholics and to Catholics in more generally about our shared history in this way?
I'm glad you picked up on that.
Yeah.
Because that's the point I make at the end of the book that sometimes gets glossed over, I think, but it's been so important to me.
Yeah.
LGBT history, as I'm sure you know, and a lot of people are starting to realize, is not something that's well known in our society overall. So it's something that at least I didn't learn about in school.
Right.
My family didn't talk about it, not because they're cruel, they just didn't know it, and why would they? And we didn't hear about it in church. I haven't heard it preached about. And that's, I think, why I felt so isolated, because it did feel very new to me. So as I've been uncovering this history, I've been inspired by the number of LGBT people who have worked tirelessly in the church to make it a more welcoming space. Their friends and family who have endured some personal attacks sometimes, who have maybe been relegated in parish life because they speak up when these issues arise. And that has made me realize that if there is a Catholic space that is welcoming to LGBT people, it's because other people did a lot of hard work before that. So in the book, I write about a parish in San Francisco called Most Holy Redeemer, which is right in the middle of the gay neighborhood, the Castro in San Francisco. And so on the one hand, you think, okay, you have this Catholic church in the middle of the gay neighborhood of San Francisco. Of course it's welcoming to LGBT people. Like, that's just the way nature works, right? But I found out that wasn't the case, that it took a lot of hard work from the LGBT community, Catholic priests who were kind of a little more forward-thinking, and really kept at it over a number of years. So for me, learning that history has felt like it's empowered me to be more confident in my own place in the church. That isolation is gone. Coming to talks like this, where I meet friends and allies who are interested in the same topics, who share their own stories with me, it's made me realize that there's a much bigger community out there than I would have never encountered had I not done this work. So I think that learning the history has helped me understand my own identity more, and it's been a privilege to be able to go share that with others as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure to kind of integrate too, I know that's something that is difficult for myself and for a lot of gay Catholics, kind of integrating that Catholic identity and that gay identity, which I'm sure is really, I really felt comforted by that tie-in in your book.
Yeah, and just meeting people who haven't thought of it as you need to choose one or the other. That there's different models of living out your faith. That I sometimes joke that I don't think it's easy for anyone to be Catholic. My context is the LGBT issue, because that's what I've been dealing with. But everyone at some point feels not welcome because of a statement or an action or a relationship gone bad. And I hope that there's some inspiration in these stories of people who made it work in a variety of ways. Maybe they find a parish that's welcoming and go there, or maybe they ignore the hurtful statements and just kind of move on, or maybe they leave when it's not healthy and come back. But there are these different examples of you don't have to choose all the time, that there are ways to integrate the faith, like you said. Yeah,
absolutely. It's more than meets the eye. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you a question about one of my favorite parts of the book, which was your conversations about different vigils and protests and demonstrations that went on throughout the AIDS crisis. I know one for me that was particularly moving was the Stop the Church protest at St. Patrick's, and if you'd like to maybe explain a little bit to those of us who haven't read the book yet. But I wondered if there were any particular stories of vigils or demonstrations that were particularly moving to you. I found them so moving, and I'd love to hear how you thought about them.
Yeah, that's another great question. So sometimes at these events, I get the questions ahead of time, and I kind of review them and edit them back. I did get the questions ahead of time, but I didn't read them. So I'm very impressed with this. This is really good. Thank you. So the Stop the Church protest, 1989, December 1989. You maybe read this more recently than I have.
That's true.
A group of radical HIV and AIDS activists called ACT UP, with chapters all over the country, but a really aggressive one in New York. They had been protesting the government, they'd been protesting Wall Street, pharmaceutical companies, and then at one point they decided that they had to target the Catholic Church. And it was because they felt the church could do whatever it wanted on the inside if it wanted to discriminate against LGBT people. They didn't think that was their concern. But once they saw Catholic bishops kind of wading into public health debates, debates over condoms, debates over LGBT non-discrimination laws, which were vitally important because there was no job protection or couple protection. So if you were diagnosed with HIV, you could lose your job, lose your insurance, you could be kicked out of your house. And there were bishops kind of fighting against not even same-sex marriage at that point, but sort of non-discrimination laws. So ACT UP decided that they wanted to be political because they saw the church acting political. So they planned this massive protest inside St. Patrick's Cathedral, a Sunday during Lent. The cathedral's packed. And the idea was it was supposed to be a silent protest during the homily because they saw that as sort of the least sacred and maybe most political part of the Mass because the priest, or the cardinal in this case, was preaching. It kind of goes wrong and becomes a very loud, aggressive protest. Lots of people are arrested. People are throwing themselves on the floor, causing a scene. And the worst part, as a Catholic anyway, learning about the history, was learning that at least one of the protesters desecrated the host, which ends up becoming the sort of dominant media storyline the next day, and it's a very controversial protest. Even many members of ACT UP said that it was not a good look for the organization, that it hadn't worked. But it was one of, what I learned, it was one of several different kinds of protests happening at the time. So there's LGBT Catholic groups like Dignity that were protesting inside the church, pushing for change. There were candlelight vigils taking place all around the country, many led by HIV and AIDS groups like ACT UP, but also by Catholic organizations as well. There's a story in the book about this sort of interesting candlelight vigil that took place in Chicago where a Catholic church hosted it. It was run by an interfaith organization, but at the same time you had this group of leather enthusiasts meeting in Chicago at the same time, and they sort of joined forces, even though they might not necessarily overlap in their interests. You can read the book for more details. So you have this kind of thing happening. But one vigil that particularly stands out to me was, this is appropriate for Lent, there was a Stations of the Cross that a young Jesuit priest named Father William Hart McNichols had created specifically around someone being diagnosed with HIV and the journey that they would go on as they developed AIDS and eventually passed away from AIDS-related complications. And this particular Stations of the Cross was the basis of a candlelight vigil at Fordham University in the 1980s. And when I was writing the book, it was a fairly straightforward section of the book toward the end where I talked to some people who were present at the vigil and described the powerful emotions. I described the Stations of the Cross and the various disappointments and hardships that a person with HIV and AIDS in the 1980s and 90s would face. Pretty straightforward, moving, but it was actually at an event a couple weeks ago. I was in Connecticut speaking at a college up there, and someone in the audience raised his hand, and he said he had more of a comment than a question, which can be dangerous, but I was happy to listen. And he told this moving story about how he had just finished the book the night before, and it had been difficult for him when he got to that section, which is toward the end, because he was actually a student, a freshman at Fordham, and remembers that vigil, and he desperately wanted to go, but he was so ashamed that he was gay and not out that someone might see him there and he'd be outed.
Wow.
He said it was so bad that he remembers looking out his dorm window at the vigil, being afraid that someone outside might look up at him and see him looking out and know. And he said that he had always regretted not having the courage to go, but he was happy to have learned what actually happened at the vigil because he read the book and learned some of the account from that. So these powerful stories have so many different perspectives, and it was a real gift to me to be able to hear a perspective I hadn't thought about previously. So these different protests and vigils did an amazing job of reminding people of the suffering that's happened behind closed doors. That was the point of them all, to kind of bring that out into the streets. And Catholics were a big part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, what a moving story. That's so beautiful that he he was
Yeah.
able to share that with you and with everyone else.
Yeah, it was very generous of him.
Yeah, and goes to show that there are just so many stories like this that are just packed everywhere.
I know, and we were chatting in the foyer earlier, and so many people, I'm sure, here have stories that could be contributed, and I just love these events where people are able to share some of those, and really, I hope, create a dialogue, because this is a moment in the church where there was a lot of pain, but there's also a lot I think we as Catholics can be proud of, that there were people who stepped up in spite of the shame and stigma. So it's a real opportunity, I think, to take a piece of history that is often overlooked and consider how we might draw inspiration from it today.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I'm glad you said that, because I also wanted to ask you, I really appreciated about the book that you weren't afraid to say, and you didn't shy around the negative ways that the church impacted the AIDS crisis, and the ways that, the institutional church and also just individual Catholics were often antagonistic or even cruel, but you also take such care with telling these stories of tenderness and compassion. What was it like for you to strike that balance of kind of a dominant negative narrative, but also this really important positive narrative?
It was a challenge.
Yeah.
There are a lot of books out there that give a much more comprehensive history of society in general and what different institutions and organizations were doing around HIV and AIDS. And generally, sort of the narrative is that the church, the Catholic Church in particular, was a powerful political force that failed because it undermined public health campaigns. It fought against these non-discrimination laws. Cardinal O'Connor, the Archbishop of New York, was on the White House's AIDS Commission. So it's difficult in today's church, I think, to just remember the immense political power that church leaders had in the 1980s. And there were a lot of negative stories. And I do, in the book, make an effort to present some of them because I think the context is important.
Definitely.
So one kind of piece of data that stuck with me is that a poll that came out in the 1987, I believe, from Pew Research Center, found that 43% of Americans agreed with the statement that HIV and AIDS might be a punishment from God for people leading an immoral lifestyle. So that's 43% of Americans not only believe that, but were willing to admit it to a pollster. So that sense of kind of more morality being attached to illness was probably fairly high, even more than 43%. So the shame and stigma was not unique to the Catholic Church by any means. It was every sector of society, including people who I think today might look at what they were thinking and saying back then and be pretty ashamed of their actions. And growth is good. It's good that people have evolved beyond that. But the Catholic Church was not immune to this kind of general societal shame around the issue and stigma and bigotry. But that's not the story I wanted to tell. I thought the context was important, but for me, I'm more interested in the people who, despite that, did the right thing. So people like Sister Carol, who moved to New York and volunteered on an AIDS hotline, worked the AIDS wards at St. Vincent's and St. Clair's Hospital, befriend gay Catholics who introduce them to the LGBT community and remind them that even if they don't realize that they have biases they have to overcome before they can help the community, and end up moving back home to their small town and opening an AIDS resource center. So like, that's really amazing work. And someone who was humble enough to say, yeah, maybe I'm not that comfortable around the community, but I can learn how to respond to their needs. And that was inspiring to me because there's so many temptations to sort of join the crowd that's condemning X, Y, or Z. But I think our faith, I think the gospel compels us to step back for a moment and consider how we might reply to situations in a better way. So my goal was to set the context, but also highlight the stories that we can be proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you did, because I'm very proud of those stories as well. And it's important that we as Catholics also take them as hope and inspiration for how we can move forward too.
Yeah, it's part of our history that I
Yeah.
think we should claim as something we can be proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I read that you corresponded with Pope Francis about this book.
did.
What was that like?
Yes, I did. So I had finished writing the book. It was last summer, and it was off to the printer. It was done. And I started to kind of think back to some of the interviews I had done, some of the people I'd met, and a couple themes kept coming up. One was almost everyone I interviewed talked about how thankful they were that we have Pope Francis today, that they were encouraged by his commitment to at least having a dialogue around difficult issues, even if there weren't changes. At least there was this openness to talking about difficult issues. So Pope Francis kept coming up, even though he was not a major figure in the church in the time period I'm writing about.
Right.
And then secondly, it occurred to me that the people I interviewed who were doing this work were really living out that field hospital Catholicism that the Pope talks about so often. Kind of the church needs to be out with those who are hurting, those who are in need of care, without judgment and condemnation, sort of, you don't ask about cholesterol when someone's bleeding out in front of you. And I thought, these are Pope Francis Catholics. Now it's an anachronism because there was no Pope Francis back then, but I wanted him to know about them. So I wrote the Pope a letter and introduced him to some of the people I wrote about. I told him that I'm a gay Catholic journalist. I said there's a lot of people in the United States who are very thankful for his ministry, even if that doesn't always come across in headlines. Encouraged him to keep up the invitation to dialogue, and I sent him a copy of the book. A mutual friend brought it over and gave it to him and told me that the Pope would be writing me a letter, and I rolled my eyes because that's ridiculous. But sure enough, it arrived a couple weeks later, a letter from the Pope, and it was very cool as a journalist. Like, I try to downplay that because it sounds not gracious, but it was very cool to have my work recognized by the Pope. Like, that's very exciting. But the best part of it was Pope Francis sort of offered this decades-late papal blessing on the people I wrote about, and he recognized not only their work, which he invoked Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 25, and said that these people were undertaking that work, but he recognized that they did so at great risk to their reputations and in some instances their vocation. So being able to call Father Bill, Sister Carol, David Pace, a lay Catholic who engaged in HIV and AIDS work, and read them the letter before it was made public was very moving. They were understandably emotional about it. And it wasn't that they were looking for sort of validation from the Pope. Like, they were very confident in their work. I think they're beyond the point of needing like a thumbs up from the Pope. But they had felt seen because they were often doing this work away from the limelight, in some instances getting pushback from church leaders because they were maybe too close to a community that was not always in agreement with the church. So I think the lesson there for me was that doing the right thing might not always feel good in the moment, especially if you're working with marginalized communities, but ideally history catches up and maybe the Pope will write a letter someday. Thank you. So, yeah, it was really nice.
Yeah, that's so great. I can only hope that he will. Yeah, how do you hope that this work and other works that might be inspired by it or in the same vein might move us forward as a church into the future?
I know, the forward-looking questions.
Sorry.
I always say that one of the benefits of writing about a defined historical period, so in my case, 1981 to 1996, is I don't have to have any opinions on what's happening now or what might happen in the future, which is good for me as a reporter. But I do hope that it contributes to this ongoing conversation. People sometimes ask me if I'm hopeful for the future when it comes to the place of LGBT people and their friends and family in the church. And the reporter side of me is sometimes a little negative and skeptical because that's what we're paid to do. But events like this kind of make me more inspired that these conversations are happening, that as I travel the country telling these stories, there appears to be this great hunger to engage in this kind of sharing, to reflect on how we can make the church more welcoming, that there's parishes that are starting LGBT groups, hoping that we don't just keep losing young LGBT people, that we show that there is a space that's welcome. Being invited to Catholic colleges and engaging with campus ministry, learning the stories of young LGBT people today who feel really encouraged by learning this history. I was giving a talk in New York. Time has kind of lost meaning. It was before the shutdown, the week before the shutdown. And it was about the podcast, about the Plague podcast. And most of the crowd was older. It was New York. I think a lot of the crowd had lived through that time, was kind of there to learn some of the stories they maybe didn't know about firsthand, to share some of their own stories. But there was one group of younger people in their 20s, and I was chatting with them after. And it was very casual. It probably didn't feel profound to them, but to me it was very moving when they told me that they were glad that they had learned this history from the podcast because they would have felt less alone had they known it. So the same feelings that I had been having, that I spent years as a reporter trying to work through, they were feeling something similar, and I was able to provide a resource that hadn't existed before. So I'm hopeful that that kind of dynamic can continue.
Yeah, Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm hopeful for that too. I'm so grateful as well for your decision to be honest about being a gay Catholic reporter as you move into this work. And I saw throughout the book just so many examples of what LGBT people bring to the church. What do you think are some of the gifts of LGBT people's participation in the church?
Yeah, there's so many. And that's been one of the gifts of being more open about who I am and kind of writing in a more personal way than I'm used to, is that others share their stories with me. I think a couple things. So one example that came through the reporting for the book is Sister Carol's story. So it was tempting for me to kind of frame her as this heroic figure who overcomes her biases and serves this marginalized community. And that is true, like that all happened.
Yeah.
And that's one way to look at the story. But Sister Carol had the great insight to say that it wasn't sort of this one-way street where she was providing this ministry to this downtrodden community. She said that her interaction with the community actually broadened her own understanding of faith, that by seeing love expressed in a way that she hadn't considered before or hadn't known before, it helped her understand the gospel more. It helped her understand what it means to be a Christian. And so that opportunity for our own faith to be edified or even expanded through dialogue and engagement, I think is something that the LGBT Catholic community and their friends and families have a unique perspective and can help the wider church understand things in a new way. Secondly, I write about in the book, we talked about ACT UP earlier and the sort of rowdy protests that were held. And those took a lot of creative energy to undertake, whether they were successful or not, whether they kind of crossed the line. Like, a lot of creativity went into those.
Certainly.
And there was this study of ACT UP that came out in the 90s that showed in New York, it was something like 40% of the organization was Catholic or had been Catholic. And I just thought, imagine if they had felt welcome in the church. That kind of creative energy, that youthful vigor could have been in the institution working for change. And there's one story in the book about a young guy who had grown up in a very Catholic household in Iowa before moving to New York and was really torn about things like Stop the Church, but ultimately just didn't feel like he had a place in the church and left. And someone who has so much creativity and could have done so much good for the church had he felt welcome. Now, he didn't feel like it was a place that would be helpful for him to stay, so he had no choice to walk away, he said. But I just think we're seeing that dynamic play out today. I write a lot about LGBT people who are fired from Catholic institutions, people who are kicked out of things like choir or food pantry volunteering, or even religious communities because of who they are once their orientation or their marriage becomes public. And I'm afraid that that message will drive other people away too, and I just think of the gifts we're losing as a result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are so many gifts that we all bring, and we want to see those celebrated. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're close to wrapping up, but I wonder, we have been talking at St. Thomas More a lot about the synod on synodality that's going on, and I'm sure you've explored it a little bit in your work. I wonder how you might see the hopes for your work and the hopes for the synod kind of overlapping at all?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that the parish is talking about it, because not a lot of parishes are talking about
it.
So it's hopeful when I hear that there are faith communities kind of taking this seriously and engaging the Pope's invitation for dialogue about what it means to be a church that walks together. It's a good question. I am skeptical about the capacity for a meeting to bring about the kind of change the Pope imagines, but it doesn't mean it's not worth doing. I remember being in Rome covering the Synod on the Family in 2014, 2015, and there was a real energy there. The Pope was still relatively new on the scene at that point. He wanted the church to talk about difficult family issues like divorce and remarriage, homosexuality, what it means to be a parent with a child who's LGBT, how the church can be more welcoming. And I think there was this energy there, even among bishops from around the world who hadn't felt like they could talk about these issues before, and now you have the Pope saying, no, please do this. So I'm hopeful that that energy comes back. We'll see how it plays out over the next year, but I'm heartened to hear that conversations are happening, because I do hope that lay people feel like they can say what's on their mind. There is this sort of openness in the church today.
Thank you. Well, before we open it up for questions, is there anything else that you would like to tell and hear about?
That's what I end every interview with. It's a great journalism skill. No, I'm super impressed by your questions. Thanks for your thoughtfulness and preparing for that. I really
Thank you so much for being here with us. Let's give Michael a round of applause, please. Thank you.
Thank you. For those of you here, we invite you to, if you have a question, to write it down on one of the index cards in the pews. And Kathy Farrell, do you mind just collecting them? And also those online, we'll put the URL on the screen so you can ask a question. And we do have someone who's streaming from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Gabrielle. Did your research ever lead you to the church's missionary impact in Africa during this time in light of their public health views concerning HIV and AIDS? If so, how did it relate to other research for the book?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I did focus mostly on the United States in this kind of defined historical period. But for the podcast, we were able to devote one episode to the church's ministry around HIV and AIDS in South Africa today. And it was interesting. Part of the early kind of genesis of the project was I had kind of known that the church is a leader when it comes to global HIV and AIDS health. It's one of the most robust ministries of the global church, and it's kind of leading part of the public health response overall. So I was really curious, like, how did that happen? How did the church have so many stumbles in the early days here, and what led it to become sort of this global leader around the world? In terms of the question, there is still a lot of disagreement when it comes to public health messaging around the use of condoms to fight HIV. The Catholic Church and its various missions are clear about church teaching on that. So it's not something that's been settled over the past couple of decades, but I think that's another area that is not as well known as it should be, and Catholics should be proud of, that the church is a global leader in the fight against HIV and AIDS, which is still an ongoing struggle, not only around the world, but here in the United States too. HIV rates are rising in some communities. Tens of thousands of people are diagnosed each year. Communities of color are particularly hard hit. So even though the book is a history, it's still very much an ongoing challenge with some signs of hope, but something that we might consider how we're responding to today as well.
Michael, a question from someone here. Where do you see the church's position on transgender and persons who are transitioning? Like, where do you see the church's position going? And I know that it seems to me the church doesn't necessarily have a clear theology or position.
Yeah, I've been thinking about these issues as I cover them because it's been in the news a lot the past couple of years, and mostly in a negative way. There's some dioceses that are putting out statements that might ban trans Catholics or LGBT Catholics overall from sacraments. There's some theological efforts to understand the question of what it means to be trans and Catholic present to us, but often it's a pretty condemning tone. And I usually think about, from the book, one of these examples of a Catholic space that became welcoming to LGBT people in the 80s and 90s, St. Vincent's Hospital in New York. Again, sort of, I take it as inevitable that this Catholic hospital in Greenwich Village with a large gay population would be welcoming, but there was a lot of work that went into that, and you had Catholic sisters who ran the hospital kind of stepping back and saying, why is the gay community protesting us? Like, we think we're doing a good job, but obviously something's not working, so we need to listen. And they had sort of the humility and confidence to step back and listen to the community. And I wonder if church leaders might benefit from that kind of attitude today with people who identify as transgender. Maybe listening before speaking might yield better results. I don't see a lot of that listening taking place yet.
Someone said that the title of the book, Hidden Mercy, is powerful. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes.
Was that your original title?
I know, I'm smirking.
Is,
I should have a better answer. It was a title that a group of us came up with that I was not in favor of originally, but I've come around to it. No, the hidden part especially. So many of these stories are just not known. Aside from some cursory coverage that was happening in real time, like the 80s and 90s, I don't think we as a church have done a good job kind of collecting them and passing them on. And I think that hiddenness is what allowed a lot of the work to take place. I think if people had been more visible, there might have been more of a pushback, and some of the ministries might not have thrived. So I'm glad that I'm able to help shine a light on some of those today. I agree, it is a good title. Yeah.
And someone asked, did you, as you did your research and so on, did you get any sense, was there any collaboration of the Catholic Church with other faith traditions or communities of faith?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, in so many instances, there were other faith traditions, often much more at the center of these kinds of things, from traditions that were, even at that point, already more welcoming to the LGBT community. And often kind of out there putting out the resources, and Catholics could volunteer through those, they could partner with those. In Chicago, there was a robust network called the AIDS Pastoral Care Network, which was started by a Catholic seminarian, but really included the entire faith community in Chicago. And the idea was there wasn't a lot of pastoral care available to people with HIV and AIDS, and that was particularly difficult for me to understand, or not to understand, to encounter, because early in the crisis, mostly young men were being affected by HIV, men in their 20s and 30s. And if you were diagnosed and developed AIDS, it was a very rapid decline. Most people did not survive. And these situations prompted the kind of reflection on mortality that I think a lot of people think they have decades before they have to consider them. And often people will turn to their faith in these situations because it helps make sense of these questions of life and death. So you have young guys in their 20s and 30s who are now suddenly forced to deal with these very difficult questions. And even when they wanted to turn to their faith, if they didn't feel completely pushed out, they weren't being welcome. So they were cut off from these resources that many of us might take for granted. And so in Chicago, you had a group of interfaith leaders who said, we can do better. We can even just connect people to priests and sisters or ministers from other traditions who can listen, can help make sense of some of these questions, knowing that it wasn't as easy as going to your parish to ask a priest a question because you didn't know if you'd be welcomed, if you'd be subject to verbal abuse when that was the last thing you needed. So a lot of that kind of interfaith work happened around the pastoral care side of things. And Catholics were involved, Catholics were leading at some points, but it did bring together a lot of different communities around this one issue.
As you've interviewed priests from that time, and you know priests, either who may be out or not, I'm curious, comes from a question here, but I'm curious myself. This person writes, if priests can't model coming out in public themselves, do you think their silence hampers or rings hollow with other lay Catholics? And do you know any priests who choose not to come out, and what is the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, it's not an easy decision. In the book, I profile one priest who was diagnosed with HIV in the 1990s and died from AIDS-related complications in 1991. And he had been fairly active in making his parish welcoming to the LGBT community, establishing an HIV and AIDS ministry at the parish. And he decided that when he was getting close to death, that he wanted the reason for his death to be made public. So he asked his friend, who would be preaching at his funeral, to state in the homily that he died from AIDS-related complications. Not to make it the focus of the homily, but to at least acknowledge what had happened, because there was a trend happening in the church where many priests were affected by HIV and AIDS, and there was an effort to obscure the true cause of their death, either by changing the birth certificate or simply telling untruths to people when they were asked about how a priest died. So his decision to come out not only about how he died, but also his sexual orientation, sort of implicitly, was something that was not easy for him. And there is something courageous about it, that he was able to offer this show of solidarity with a community in need as sort of this final act of love and solidarity. At the same time, it struck me as a little sad that he felt like he could only do that after he had passed away, that he wasn't able to do that in any meaningful way anyway when he was still living. And that was a trend I think that I saw a lot, that there were many priests, sisters involved in this ministry who were called to it because it was their own community, but didn't feel like they could be public about that. And one of the priests in the book, Father Bill McNichols, chose a different path and did come out early as a young priest and suffered some setbacks as a result of that. So I feel for priests today, especially, who maybe don't feel like they have the ability to be more public about their own inner life, but I imagine it's a very difficult decision and a very personal decision to have to make.
A question from Dr. Kenneth from Immaculate Heart of Mary Church, which is local here. What is the church's position on the use of pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV to prevent HIV? PrEP. I'm not sure what that is. Do you mind
Yeah, so
explaining?
PrEP is a sort of medication that can be used to prevent the spread of HIV. It's sort of seen as a tool that could potentially eradicate HIV if it becomes widely used and widely available among communities that have a higher risk for contraction and transmission. It's a great question, and I think it's something the church hasn't quite figured out what we think yet. I'm actually trying to work on a story now about different perspectives on this issue, and part of the reason I think the church hasn't had to grapple with this is most people who are seeking PrEP aren't going to a Catholic-run institution for the prescription, so there's really not that much. It's not like condoms where in the 1980s Catholic hospitals wanted to give out condoms to kind of help contribute to this public health campaign. It's very much more of a doctor-patient relationship where the church doesn't typically wade in too much into that. But there are theological questions around it, and at least one Catholic organization came out against PrEP, which was fairly shocking to a number of Catholic moral theologians and ethicists who were surprised by that. So it's an ongoing conversation, and I think as PrEP becomes more widely known, perhaps we'll see some more conversation around it.
Someone asked, what exactly would you like the church to do?
So before we started tonight, I told Andy that I'm used to dodging questions, and that will be one that I will dodge. Yeah, no, I don't have an opinion on what the church should or shouldn't do. I'm interested in reporting the stories on what's actually happening, but thank you to whoever asked that.
Did you write the book, right, as a journalist, you seek to be as unbiased as you can. Obviously, I understand how can you not have a bias with this topic. Did you seek to write the book from as an unbiased as perspective as you could?
Yeah, it was an interesting process where my initial draft of the book was very much, here are the stories, here's a profile of different individuals who responded with care and compassion during this difficult time. But editors kept coming back to me and saying, why are you writing this book? Like, your reader's going to have to understand and trust you in order to take what you're writing seriously, because it just doesn't make sense that we would revisit this time 30 years later. So I was pushed to be more personal, and it wasn't something I had planned for, not something I have a lot of experience doing, that kind of personal writing. Coming out in the New York Times was not on my bucket list, but I ended up doing it, and I think as a result, the stories have been much more honest. That example of Sister Carol asking why I wanted to learn these stories, I think by being honest with her and then everyone else I interviewed, sort of created this space where I was willing to divulge something about myself that maybe isn't always easy, and as a result, they felt more comfortable sharing some of their stories from their past as well. So I don't regret it. I think often you hear this a lot, but coming out is almost always a good thing. You don't usually regret it because you kind of learn the truth about friends and family, and in this instance, it's just made my own reporting, I think, more honest, and I've been blessed by the Jesuits in America who have supported me through this and given me the space to be honest as well.
Well, thank you for your vulnerability in the book and even tonight. Someone asks, just recognizing the difficulty of the church and society not being so welcoming of LGBTQ people. What is, basically, why do you stay in the church? And I know you mentioned briefly, I think in the book, of considering an Episcopalian church, but if you could just talk a little about that experience.
Yeah, there's been a lot of thinking about why do I stay. And I'm giving a talk tomorrow where I address some of this. For me, it's come down to a couple things. There's certainly a cultural connection to Catholicism that I think a lot of people understand. I grew up in a great Catholic family, went to church every Sunday, a nice suburban parish in Massachusetts, and it was going to be difficult to kind of give up that cultural connection. But for me, it's been the sacraments. It's sort of a more pious answer than I'm used to talking about publicly. But something about the Eucharist that has drawn me to my faith that I just haven't found elsewhere. And I'm not the sort of activist-y type who would say, like, you can't kick me out, this is my home, even though that is a valid reason to stay, and that's a reason a lot of people in the book cite when I interview them. But for me, I'm drawn into that community around the Eucharist, and I haven't wanted to leave that over something I don't think I should be asked to. So it's really been that connection to the sacraments that keeps me here.
Thank you. You know, the name of your podcast was Plague, you know, and certainly was an epidemic, a public health epidemic, and here we are in a public health pandemic. Dr. Kenneth from IHM asks, are there any parallels you see between the Catholic Church's response to the AIDS epidemic and its response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah. So when I was doing some early reporting on COVID, I called up some of the people I profiled in the book to ask them that exact question. For me, it had been sort of using my imagination to imagine what it was like during this public health crisis in the 1980s and 90s because I was too young to remember it firsthand. And early on, anyway, there was at least a glimpse of some of the fear I think the gay community probably experienced. But everyone I asked that question, they were hesitant to draw too many parallels because they were so different. So one difference, early on, HIV and AIDS, it was pretty clear that it wasn't going to be the kind of transmissible virus that presented a huge kind of public health crisis like COVID did because it required intimate contact. So as a result of that understanding and that scientific understanding, Catholics could respond. You could do things like visit the sick. You could open up hospices. You could bring food to people who weren't able to get out of the house. You could cook and clean. You could hold someone's hand as they lay dying. And that presented an opportunity to kind of do something to respond in a positive way. Whereas in the early days of this pandemic, the thing to do to help was to stay home. And that was kind of a different thing. So I don't know that there'll be as many similar stories from the early days of this pandemic as there were to early days of HIV and AIDS. At the same time, you had a government response, at least. I was going to say robust government response in the early days, but you had a government response, like it was being talked about, whereas HIV and AIDS was ignored by the government here for a number of years before it became sort of a serious response. So again, another difference. One thing I think Catholics should be proud of during this pandemic is the Pope really backing vaccines early on, kind of understanding the misinformation out there, some of it put out by some Catholic bishops, by some Catholic organizations, and responding, saying, no, Catholics have a moral obligation to be vaccinated against this. So that was a big change for the better, I think. But I remain a little hesitant to draw too many parallels because they are such different, unique crises.
And then finally, a question from someone here. How can we support these communities of LGBTQ plus people?
It sounds like the parish here is doing a great job. I was kind of reading up on some of the ministries before I came tonight and scrolling through the Facebook page and saw that there's a meeting on St. Patrick's Day for LGBT people and allies, which is great encouragement. I think that sense that we talked about earlier about listening, about asking what has your experience been, what can we do as a community, rather than kind of saying, here's what we're going to do for you as a community, is really helpful. Of making sure that people know that when they come to church, they won't feel unwelcome, either during Mass or during social gatherings, and just really creating a space where people feel welcome. And I know that's a charism of this community here, so it sounds like things are already working, so I'm glad to hear that. So keep at it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate, again, your candor and your vulnerability and for being here. And I'd like to ask our pastor, Father Bob, to offer a few words.
Good evening. I'm Bob Hussey. I'm the pastor here at STM. a number of months ago, a non-Catholic parent came up to me and said she wanted to talk to me because her child identified as Catholic. Michael, it was so wonderful to read your book and to hear you tonight and your expressions. As I read the book, the one thing I sort of wanted to share was all these wonderful stories of the great compassions of Catholics and how deeply you told them that they really are just examples. There were so many out there. And it brought back many memories for me, including more than 30 years ago as a Jesuit novice working in a brand new AIDS hospice that was formed by two very dynamic religious sisters, one of them also Sister Carol, Dominican sisters, and the Catholic community around them that helped build this place, and the unbelievable people who were residents there, and just the care that was given. There's so many stories. I remember this collection of people sitting around a dinner table one night, and Sister Carol leaned over to me and she said, "This is the Eucharistic table." So it was beautiful. But thank you for all that you share in helping us know this history and the richness and how we as the church have truly lived out the gospel. And we're grateful to have you here this evening. Lindsay, thank you to you also for this wonderful guiding of our conversations and insightful reflections and questions for us. Michael's going to be in the narthex afterwards. If you'd like to speak with him, he'll also have his books and signing for us. As has been mentioned here about a group in our parish, as of right now, we don't yet have a recognized group of LGBTQ members of our parish and friends, but we want to see if there's an interest in forming that. And tonight's a good night to talk about it, but we're also doing other publicity. There's a flyer out in the narthex. So on St. Patrick's Day, there's going to be a first exploratory meeting. I'm grateful to Lindsay to help with our leadership of that too. And so I hope that perhaps some of you would be interested or would also help share the word. Thank you all very much for your engagement and participation tonight. You're always welcome here at St. Thomas More, and I hope for many other events like this. Thank you all.
All right, so you can join us out front for book signings. Excellent.